Today, we're sitting with Martha Reardon Bewick. She's a local Hingham resident. She's a census enumerator with the United States Census Bureau, and she's an author of Tranquility Grove, the 1844 Abolitionist Picnic. We're going to be sitting down and talking about how might the abolitionists of the mid-1800s have reacted to the events that are occurring right now here in the United States. Martha, welcome to South Shore Diversity Spotlight. We're here today to talk about sort of comparing and contrasting, if you will, the events that took place over 150 years ago here in Hingham, the Abolitionist Picnic, and what that might look like today in light of all that's occurring in our society vis-a-vis the tragedy of the George Floyd death, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Keep America Blue thin line going. And we talked a little bit about, is it absolutely a either or? Why does it have to be that way? And let's just talk about how the comparisons might look like going back 150 years ago and the dialogue that was taking place around the abolitionist movement.
Well, it's a huge area to talk about the 176-year difference, and then the circumstances were different then in that there was still slavery, and the work of the abolitionists, which was fiercely anti-slavery, was their main direction in life. And as we talked about last year, I think you asked me what they would have thought about Colin Kaepernick's taking a knee, and I said they would be right out there taking a knee with him. And look how things have changed now. Everybody's taking a knee because finally, I think the George Floyd, the horror of that murder, basically got to everyone in the United States and around the world. And I think people, as they must have said it at a certain point in the early 1800s, today they're saying this is enough. There's too much. This is a line, and we can go no further. And so what I think is wonderful is the going back to the beginnings, taking a look at H.R. 40, which Congressman Jackson, I believe, from Texas, had submitted, which looks at the roots of the history of blacks in America, slavery, and will explore reparations. So look how far we've come in a year. It's just stunning and remarkable and hopeful too, I think.
Let's talk a little bit about Hingham specifically. Why do you suppose Hingham was the site of this abolitionist picnic? Why did they choose Hingham?
Well, I think that there was a fairly straightforward answer. One was that this happened in 1844. And in 1842, that was the time when the abolitionists started to say, this is something we should be celebrating, the emancipation of slaves in the West Indies. Emancipation Day, August 1st. Emancipation Day had taken place on 1833. It was announced in 1834. So the picnic was going to be in 1844. There was a man who came from Hingham, who in 1842-3 was working with Garrison and was assigned to become the editor of the abolitionist newspaper in New York. The New York, what was it? The Anti-Slavery Standard, it was called. As it turns out, he'd grown up around the corner from Tranquility Grove. He knew it as a beautiful place, and he recommended it as a venue. And so I think it simply was for that reason that became the venue. Ironically, last night I was looking at the film about Harriet, a wonderful film about Harriet Tubman. And one of the scenes shows a group of abolitionists, black and white, gathering in Pennsylvania to talk about how they would have to move people who were fugitive slaves from the south to Canada. So instead of 100 miles, it'd have to go 600 miles. The man there at the map was Hingham's own Sidney Howard Gay. And it was wonderful to see that Hingham's was part of the national effort for fugitive slaves, the help for fugitive slaves, abolitionism, and so forth. So as the book talks about, and as we mentioned last year, a number of Hingham people were very much involved with the movement.
And that's the point that I wanted to really explore, is that there is this history here in Hingham of like-minded people who can see what's wrong and what needs to be fixed. I mean, it's one thing to pick Hingham because of the proximity to Boston, to the water, to one individual, but there are like-minded people in the community who must have embraced this idea of bringing in this abolitionist gathering.
Oh, of course, there was a very strong community, or committee here in the community. The chairman was on the, either a selectman or on the board of the school committee. And he was the one who pulled together a lot of anti-slavery songs and created a book. You may remember that the minister at New North Church at the time, when he came to town, was an abolitionist already. And there were a number of active abolitionists in the town, the Thaxters, and there was an abolitionist community based at New North Church. So yes, there was a community of people who were very much involved with Garrison and the types of activities that the abolitionists of the Boston area would hold. It would be not only a picnic, but it could be a money-raising fair with goods that were sold and sent in from different countries. But no, there was a large community, but still I think they were the minority. I mean, even though this brought in 10,000 people that day for the picnic, and the bells of the town rang, and all the stores were decorated up, there was still hostility, and that came out in subtle ways.
How did it resolve itself, if in fact there was some hostility, if you will, between those who were supportive of the picnic being held here in town and those who were against the idea? Were you able to find any artifacts that suggested that they ultimately resolved their differences?
Not really. There was one clue in the Hingham Patriot. The Hingham Patriot, one of the newspapers that served the area, had an editorial the week after the picnic, and no news about the picnic as such, and they sort of huffed that nobody sent them any news. Well, the question I had is, why weren't they there themselves? And the next week after that, of course, there was a great fulsome write-up and what have you. So I do think that the media power structure was probably detached, to put it mildly. And then the other piece of information I read was that the chairman of the event left town the next year. And I have a feeling that perhaps he found it uncomfortable. I think that there was probably discomfort about the event. And as it had turned out, there was so much damage, physical damage to the Grove, that the Grove itself was torn down, or the great oaks were taken down, because of homeowners who owned it were so distraught by what happened to the Grove. So I don't know. I mean, there were little rumblings, but nothing that was overt or in the newspapers that I was able to read. But I think Hingham has always had social justice, strong social justice community for whatever the issue of the time may be. And taking in the officers, during the World War II from different countries that came in. Well, there's a tradition of hospitality in this town as well. So I think you'll always find people on different sides, however.
So as we look at what's occurring today, particularly here in our community, right here in the Hingham Bathing Beach, we've had rallies for Black Lives Matter. We've had rallies for Keep the Thin Blue Line, at times facing off against each other. How does that look in your lens insofar as our history of taking up social causes?
Well, I think it's the next step along the way. those who are working with Black Lives Matter, and then with the further into the Hingham Unity Council, and now into the creation of the new Facebook page for families of color in Hingham. I think there's going to be a deeper dive into all elements of race implications and social justice there. In terms of the thin blue line, I frankly don't understand why there's a division, because the police, as we know them in Hingham, have always been open to the community and open to the Citizens Academy, and but again, I'm not Black, and so I haven't had the experience that others might have had otherwise. So I think in each case, there are strong feelings. I know the Thin Blue Line is also affiliated with Officer Chesna's death, so there's a very emotional connection here to honor and respect him, and that was the symbol that was chosen to honor and respect him. But sadly, the symbol has been turned around and taken advantage of and used in ways that are anti-Black. So it becomes confusing. I mean, people take symbols, use them, pass them on, drop them. So I think we're in the middle of a muddle right now.
That's an interesting point. I don't know how many of our community members are aware of the fact that we had a officer of African American descent. Mr. Lewis Benito Sr. was a police officer, an auxiliary police officer right here in Hingham.
And when would that have been?
This would have been back in the 60s and 70s.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
And I think I remember seeing on your Tuttleville film, which was wonderful, and talked about Hingham's own unique Black and Native American community within the town, that there had been a very famous fire chief.
Yes, there was a firefighter as well.
What I find so exciting is there was a woman who I was intrigued by, Lucretia Leonard, who played a role in the Tranquility Grove. And after the publication of the book, of course, you always learn something new that you should have included if you'd known it at the time. But as it turned out, her mother, Margaret Leonard, married James Tuttle, who was James Tuttle was the father of James King, and James King, I guess, was the founder of Tuttleville as such. So Lucretia had a link to Tuttleville, and she and her mother came from a background of Black and Native American Wampanoag, as I understand it, ancestry, and I was fascinated in that story.
No, this is the kind of information I think that our community would enjoy hearing about, which is, again, this rich history that we have here.
Yes.
The history of the early days of the abolitionist movement, and why Hingham came to play a pivotal role, and that included hosting a visit by Frederick Douglass himself, to, as you shared here, how Hingham has responded with the first pandemic of the 1918s, if you will, to where we are today and like a second pandemic and what's occurring.
And everybody's stepping up. They're stepping up all over. And it's been wonderful to see the town full of, again, banners and signs and celebration and bells ringing to commemorate those 8 minutes of George Floyd's last 8 minutes. Very, very touching indeed. The one other thing I would like to mention before I forget is that it's been fascinating to me to see Juneteenth, which was just something that you would hear the word occasionally, but all of a sudden Juneteenth is being accepted as a holiday, the day that the slaves of Texas finally heard that there was emancipation. And it was mentioned in this book that was published in 2018, and now, of course, it's become a predominant day of liberation. Whereas at the time of the book, the day that they celebrated was the 1st of August. So there's still those who celebrate Emancipation Day in the West Indies, the 1st of August, which was the day of this huge picnic. But now Juneteenth will become the great day for the United States, I think.
Well, I hope that the current state of the discourse that's taking place will continue, at least from a dialogue standpoint, so that all the parties are informed of where each one is coming from, and hopefully find common ground, to use a euphemism that's been well worn. But nonetheless, there's got to be some common ground here for us.
Well, actually, there have been threads of common ground still weaving through the town. I had read recently that St. John's Episcopal Church, which is where the first Black Lives Rally took place here in town, but they have been running a program called Sacred Ground for some time. And this is a program that came from a very powerful group called Traces of the Trade. Traces of the Trade was established by descendants of slavers, and they were horrified to discover this as part of their family history. And so they went on to go and visit Ghana, to visit the Caribbean, to visit all those places that their family had been part of, and then to develop movies, educational programs. And then as an offshoot, one of the young women of Katrina Brown created Sacred Ground, which is something for the Episcopal Church that brings together people of black and white to be able to talk confidentially, respectfully about shared experiences of race. So this has been there. You don't know about it, but programs like this have been going on for a while. And now, though, that the whole nation's attention is turned to the roots of our original sin, slavery, finally and at long last, programs like this, I think, will grow and will perhaps for the first time face the reality of what happened beginning in 1619 and what's continued under various kinds of control until today. So it's a very moving and difficult and challenging time, but I have great hope. And what also I'm so moved by is that so many of the Black people who are participating and resisting history as usual are saying it's towards a more perfect union. What they want is not what anarchists want, which is to destroy the United States of America, and we see that going on in Portland right now. But what people who are part of the community are saying is we want what the Constitution has set forth for us. We want the more perfect union, and I think we all do.
Martha, thank you so much for visiting with us again. It's always a pleasure. I've always learned something new every time we sit and talk. You know that.
Well, but likewise, Joe, thank you so much for the honor. Really, it's a privilege to talk with you about this, and let's talk again.
I look forward to it.
Thank you.